Thank you and welcome to this information session presented by SafeWork SA and Cancer Council SA, managing the risk of heat stress and UV in the workplace. So my name is Katie Gesner. I'm an education and engagement advisor here at SafeWork SA, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. In this session, we will discuss the science behind heat stress and UV and explore what control measures businesses can put into place to prevent illness and exposure. And, you know, the timing of this webinar could not have been better planned, given the weather today and tomorrow. So we hope you're all staying cool out there, and, you know, that you get something out of this today. Before we get started, I would just like to take the time to respectfully acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening to this session. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of South Australia. So we'll meet our presenters in a moment, but first, just a little context on why we're talking about heat stress and UV exposure. So we know that the summer months bring intense heat waves, just like we're dealing with at the moment, sunny days and spending hours outdoors. However, many Australians are still not doing enough to protect themselves from exposure to heat and UV. In fact, around 70% of Australians are expected to develop skin cancer by the age of 70, with the risk of skin cancer for outdoor workers nearly double that of indoor workers. Between 2006 and 2017, heat waves were responsible for 36,000 deaths in Australia, and 13 workers died from extreme heat stress between 2001 and 2013. So it is crucial that PCBUs and workers manage the risks associated with and protect themselves from heat stress and overexposure to UV radiation. Today, we will outline how businesses can do this and unpack what you're expected to do under the South Australian WHS laws. And we hope that by the end of today, you understand the importance of protecting against heat and UV and can make a difference at your workplace just in time for the 40-degree-plus weather expected today and tomorrow. So I'm now going to introduce our speakers for today. So firstly, we have Ryan Jakowski, who is an occupational hygienist in the work environment team here at SafeWork SA. So Ryan has a bachelor's degree in medical science and an honours degree in biomedical research. His work has involved researching worker exposures to hazardous chemicals, conducting air monitoring in mines and quarries, and now regulating businesses' exposures to a myriad of hazards. So welcome, Ryan. Thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie.
And then we also have Elysia Flavel from the Cancer Council SA. So Elysia is a Senior Prevention Project Officer at Cancer Council SA with 6 years experience helping South Australians to reduce their risk of preventable cancers and supporting early detection for better outcomes. Specialising in skin cancer prevention, Elysia's focus is outdoor workplaces and supporting employers to meet their work, health and safety obligations through comprehensive strategies to address the risks associated with UV radiation overexposure. So welcome, Elysia. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you for having me.
All right, so just a quick overview of what will be covered in today's session. So first, we'll focus on heat stress and the science behind what causes it and other heat-related illnesses. Ryan will talk about the obligations for businesses under the Act to manage the risk of heat stress and UV exposure. And he'll also discuss how to manage and control the risk of heat stress with some practical examples. Then Elysia will discuss what UV radiation is and the science behind it, as well as how to assess and control the risk of harmful exposure. And finally, we'll have a Q&A session where Ryan and Elysia will endeavour to answer some of your questions. So please stick around to ask these at the end. To ask a question, you'll see at the top of your screen there is a Q&A tab. So please click on that and write your questions in there, and we will look through those at the end. Also, this session will be recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in due course, probably in a couple of days. So the recording will be available to you. We cannot give you the slides themselves, but there will be a video recording. So I'm now going to hand it over to Ryan who is going to discuss heat stress in the workplace. So Ryan, to begin with, what is the science behind heat stress?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So pretty much the human body likes to maintain itself within a very narrow temperature range to maintain a state of well-being. And as such, the temperature must be balanced between heat exchanges within the external environment and the internal metabolism to develop a sort of equilibrium. However, this equilibrium can be disturbed when increased levels of heat are generated by the environment, either by hot weather or UV, or by physical exertion, or both of them. The body then starts to overheat to a point where it can't get rid of any excess heat, and this is known as heat stress. So heat stress results from the combined contributions of the metabolic workload of the worker, air temperature, humidity, air movement, radiant heat exchange, clothing, as well as some individual factors such as fitness, age, cardiovascular disease, medications, chronic conditions, illnesses, and acclimatization. And yeah, heat stress can result in some heat-related illnesses. So with these ones, heat-related illnesses are important to monitor as they can be indicators of unacceptable levels of heat stress. These are some general sort of manageable illnesses to look out for, and illnesses people may get more commonly, such as prickly heat or heat rash. This is just the excessive sweat blocking the glands, and it usually results from skin-to-skin contact. And this just sort of presents with like a red itchy rash. You can also get heat cramps, which is just muscle cramps, and it results from the body's loss of salt due to excessive sweating. You can have heat syncope, which is also just fainting. So the body diverts the remaining blood supply to the skin just to sort of dissipate that heat. And as a result, there's not enough blood going to the brain. And so, people tend to faint. Sweet. So those are sort of the manageable ones. Then we have the more serious heat-related illnesses that require medical attention. So heat exhaustion can be a precursor to the life-threatening heat stroke. So managing this illness should be taken very seriously. And then heat stroke, if no immediate and experienced medical attention is administered, can result in death. So heat exhaustion and heat stroke can be often confused. Heat exhaustion is the loss of water in salt and sweat. Results from high heat or strenuous activity, and it's characterized by headache, increased body temp, lots of sweating, as well as just fatigue, weakness, nausea. Heat stroke is complete thermoregulatory failure. It's life-threatening, requires immediate attention, and the difference is instead of having really wet skin, it's hot and dry skin with a really high body temperature and rapid pulse and loss of consciousness. This can result in death.
Thanks for that, Ryan. It's interesting to note just how seriously the human body can be affected by heat, But if we shift it back to workplaces, what are the key industries that are affected by heat stress?
Yeah, so heat stress can occur in a multitude of different industries. This can range from event management and hospitality, such as festivals, field shows, weddings and outdoor events, even kitchens like ovens, stovetops, coffee machines, retail. They're exposed to the elements in bottle shops, coffee vans, food trucks, manufacturing and warehousing. Sometimes there can be a lack of airflow or can be very humid, especially if they're using water to clean some things. Dry cleaning and laundry, lots of machines that generate heat, construction, agriculture, gardeners and landscapers, all exposed to the elements. Emergency workers, such as firefighters and emergency response crews. Then you have couriers and postal services, as well as utility services, so services that provide electricity, water, and gas.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, there's a lot there, and maybe some there that we might not necessarily think of as being affected by heat stress. Like I think maybe the couriers and the postal workers you wouldn't necessarily think, but they are, and there's a lot of them that are.
Exactly.
So now I'm sure our audience is keen to understand exactly what their obligations are under the law. So what do the WHS Act and regulations say about managing heat stress in the workplace, and what should businesses be aware of?
Yeah, so it's important to note that there's not too many regulations or legislation specific to heat stress at all. But there are some general sort of legislative requirements that apply. One of them is from the Work Health Safety Act 2012. Section 19 is the primary duty of care, where a PCBU, a person conducting business or undertaking, must ensure the health and safety of workers and eliminate risk as far as reasonably practicable, and must provide safe systems of work, adequate facilities, training, and monitoring of workers' health. Then you have section 49 when consultation is required. So this is about the duty to consult with workers to ensure that workers are given the opportunity to express their views and contribute to the decision-making process regarding work health and safety. And it's required when identifying hazards, assessing risks, making decisions on eliminating or minimizing risks, and the adequacy of facilities. And then you have regulation 40, the duty in relation to general workplace activities. So a PCBU must ensure a workplace that allows persons to exit, enter and move around without risk, has adequate ventilation, and ensures workers working in extreme heat or cold can work without risk to health and safety. Then you have regulation 635. This is temperature and moisture content in mines. So this regulation is specific to mining only. I thought I'd just add it in just in case there are a few miners in the audience. It says that if risks of heat exist in an underground mine, to implement control measures to manage heat stress where persons work or travel, or the wet bulb temperature exceeds 27 degrees Celsius. It's also important to note that the work health safety laws in Australia do not specify a stop work temperature. This is because it doesn't include humidity, airflow, physical intensity and duration of the work, or those individual factors we talked about earlier, such as age, fitness, and health. Although some workplaces do have a heat clause included in their employee agreements, which does determine a stop work temperature. Each workplace is different, and the onus is on the employer to manage any risks.
Cool. So Ryan, you mentioned there that businesses need to eliminate or minimize the risk of heat stress to protect their workers. So how can PCBUs do that?
Yeah, so this can be done with a general sort of risk management process. So obviously starting with identifying the hazards, assessing the risks, and controlling the hazard. So with identifying, you could look at air temperature, ambient conditions, hot, what time of the year is the work being done, summer, winter, airflow, is there any air movement or breeze, can help sweat evaporate. Humidity, is humidity high? Radiant heat sources, do any sort of work processes make the surrounding environment a bit hotter? So smelting, heavy machinery, all that sort of stuff. The work requirements as well. So is the work intense or long? So, talking about the physical exertion, which generates lots of heat and sort of disturbs that equilibrium we were talking a bit about in the first slides, and whether the work requires clothing that increases the temperature. Fine line between UV exposure and being cool, but I'll let Elysia deal with that in the future slides. The workplace itself is the work performed in cramped, non-ventilated spaces, such as mines, manholes, or roofing. Then you move on to assess the risk. You could do a risk assessment, which can determine the severity of the risk, whether existing controls are effective, what action should be taken to control the risk, and how urgently is action needed. And the risk assessment needs to address the factors in the identification process. And PCBUs must do everything reasonably practical to eliminate risks and control them. So need to implement the highest order of controls using the hierarchy of controls. And as always, a combination of controls is most effective.
Yeah, perfect. So, if we're following the risk management process, I guess we sort of know what the hazard is. It's going to be extreme heat resulting in heat stress or some other related heat-related illness. But is there a specific process that PCBUs can use to assess the risk of heat stress in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So after you've identified the hazard, there's 3 levels at which you can assess the risk of heat stress, and they each have their own set of tools. And determining which level applies to you really depends on your work environment. So at level 1, everyone can do this. It's a basic risk assessment. But then you would proceed to level 2 if you've identified an unacceptable level of risk from that risk assessment. And then you would proceed to level 3 if the work environment can't be accurately assessed or penetrable clothing is used, or if the controls just aren't effective. So let's go through each of these in a bit more detail and just see what they require. So the level 1 assessment is a non-technical assessment. So anyone can do this, especially workers, and takes the form of either a basic risk assessment or work health safety. So WorkSafe Queensland have created a heat stress calculator, which covers lots of factors that can lead to heat stress, just on that little screenshot there at the right hand of the screen. It covers acclimatization, clothing, sun exposure, hot surfaces, task complexity, air movement, all of that sort of stuff. And if you sort of type in all your information into that tool, it'll sort of spit out like a low, medium, or high classification of risk, and it'll have a suggested action. So it should be noted that this is not a definitive assessment tool, the Work Health Safety Queensland tool. However, it can be used as an initial qualitative review of potential heat stress. And there's just a QR code in the bottom right-hand corner there if you guys want to give that a scan. So yeah, props to Queensland for creating that heat stress calculator. All right, on to level 2. So the level 2 of the assessment. So the second level can be used when either the calculator that we looked at in the previous slide or the risk assessment has identified an unacceptable level of heat stress risk. So this needs additional data and measuring equipment, including a dry and wet bulb globe temperature, air velocity, humidity, metabolic workload of worker, clothing, posture, most of which can be measured by the devices shown in the right-hand side of the screen there. This data can use to calculate certain indices of heat stress, including the thermal working limit, not to mention other sort of indices to measure that. And this data collection should be undertaken by a competent person, such as an occupational hygienist. Moving on to level 3. So the third level of assessment is expertise, and this should be used when data cannot be collected in a workplace. The work environment cannot be accurately assessed, so this might be more applicable to couriers, whose work environment's constantly moving around, where impenetrable clothing is used. So if someone's in a hazmat suit and you can't really measure the sweat evaporation off of the skin, or whether existing controls to heat stress are not effective. And this takes the form of physiological monitoring. So this could be saliva testing and measuring urine-specific gravity for dehydration. Could measure elevated body temperature, could be measured by swallowing a pill in the right-hand side there, or measuring heart rate, and we'll see in the heart monitor that can do that. It's also important to note that this doesn't measure environmental conditions, rather it measures the individual worker's physiological conditions, and it can also be a way of assessing the effectiveness of controls. Pardon me. So it should be undertaken by a competent person with experience in heat stress and physiology. And also to note, this process can be somewhat invasive, so you might want to consult with workers before you go making them wear anything or swallow any pills or anything like that. Cool. So when you're assessing the risk, just make sure you address all 3 of these levels of assessment, just to determine which one best applies to your workplace.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Brian. So once PCBUs have assessed the risk and they've used one or all or some of those 3 levels, what control measures can they put into place to protect their workers?
Yeah, so it depends on the work being done. As many workplaces are unique and they conduct different tasks. And to tackle this, I've just split up some slides into the indoor and then the outdoor/miscellaneous work environments. So starting with the indoor work environment, you can see the likely suspects: retail, hospitality, manufacturing, warehousing, and commercial dry cleaning. And with the controls, you can see that the indoor work environments tend to rely a bit more heavily on the engineering controls, as these environments usually are sedentary structures that are sort of better equipped to deal with heat stress. So starting with elimination and substitution, you could design buildings and structures to incorporate good airflow, just allow hot equipment to cool before using it, cancel work tasks until cooler weather. To isolate some, you could put barriers, shields, or insulation for radiant heat sources, and then place hot machinery in low work areas. For engineering controls, it's really important to introduce air conditioning and workflow, as well as some desk fans if there's a sort of desk-based work, and to dehumidify the air, all of which will sort of help the evaporation of that sweat and help the worker cool down a bit. You could insulate buildings and structures, and use of manual handling aids. So, you could use cranes and forklifts just to reduce the metabolic workload of, one person lifting something really heavy. You could also use blinds to block out that radiant heat. And for administrative controls, you could supply cool water in close proximity. You don't want workers walking 5Ks just to get hydrated. Suitable electrolyte replacements, fluid replacement protocols, making sure the workers are well hydrated. And also really important to train workers to recognize symptoms associated with heat stress. The lower order now is PPE. So you'd really want sort of light, sort of breathable clothing. And this, may take the form of like clothing that has moisture wicking properties and things like that. Or you could have cooling vests. Moving on to the outdoor work environment and the miscellaneous work environment controls. Again, likely suspects, construction, emergency workers, such as firefighters, ambulance workers, agricultural, gardeners and landscapers, couriers and postal services, utilities, mining, refineries and smelters. So this sort of outdoor work environment tends to rely a bit more heavily on administrative controls compared to the engineering and isolation of indoor work environments controls. And these work environments can sort of continually change, and it makes them slightly harder to control for. So there's a bit of crossover between some of the controls used for the indoor and outdoor work environments. So you'll see in the elimination and substitution, just allowing hot equipment to cool, cancel work tasks, automating the processes. You could use drones, especially in agriculture or, in a firefighter context, just to visualize the area instead of physically going in there. Isolation, barriers to reduce, place hot equipment away from the area. Engineering, establish cool rest areas, especially if you're outside. More for construction, to apply window tinting to vehicles. Use of manual handling aids as well. And then for administrative, cool water in close proximity. You should also schedule workers who are more acclimatized. We'll get more into that in the future. To get more people to do the job, many hands make light work. Fluid replacement protocols as well. Having worker rest intervals and worker rotation. So one thing I saw in a workplace that dealt with a lot of heat stress was worker rotation, where workers would perform a task for 30 minutes and then they'd have 60 minutes sort of resting to conduct work in a much cooler environment, just to sort of sit and recuperate for a little bit. As always, training to recognize symptoms is very important. PPE, like before, light-colored, lightweight, breathable clothing. Could do some cooling vests. And I guess in terms of radiant heat environments like smelters and really hot machinery, you could get aluminized reflective clothing as well. And yeah, so as always, many factors can contribute to heat stress, but a combination of each of these controls is most effective.
Thanks, Ryan. So, we've now got some great ideas for controls that PCBUs can implement to make sure they're complying with their duty and to protect their workers. But, I guess the workers themselves, they also have a duty under the Act to protect themselves and others from harm. So, is there anything that workers should be aware of, and things that they can do to protect themselves from heat stress?
Yeah, absolutely. So self-assessment is a very key element in training workers. So with the correct knowledge of the signs and the symptoms of heat illness and heat stress, the worker will be able to identify the early onset of heat illness and take appropriate actions. So this could involve, the workers taking a short break to rest or drink water, monitoring the urine color. You'll see a photo. There's just a chart, sort of, with urine levels. If it's clear, you're probably doing all right. Looks like battery acid, you might have a problem. You could remove unnecessary clothing, go to a cooler area, and it's also really important to emphasize having a culture where taking a break from a hot environment to work in a cooler area is normalized, encouraged, and the workers feel comfortable doing so. This is a real issue, and like everything, prevention is the best cure. And then fluid intake and thirst. So drinking to your thirst level is not a reliable indicator of the need for fluid replacement. So the sensation of being thirsty often lags behind the loss of fluid. So, urinating and sweating. And most individuals are already dehydrated to some degree. So it's better to drink smaller amounts of water more frequently than really large quantities of water more infrequently. So water can be made more palatable just by adding some low sugar flavoring if that's needed. And it's good to avoid highly caffeinated drinks and alcohol. These are diuretics and they can reduce some of that fluid and water retention in the body. And yeah, individual factors, must also be taken into account, like we mentioned, such as age, fitness level, cardiovascular disease, medication, chronic conditions, illnesses, and acclimatization, which can all impact an individual's ability to deal with heat stress. And moving on, I think it's also worth mentioning acclimatization. So workers who experience repetitive bouts of work in really hot environments can eventually become acclimatized, which can reduce heat strain. It can take approximately 15 days of continued activity in the heat to fully acclimatize. And when a worker is acclimatized, they have a decreased heart rate, more stable blood pressure, earlier onset of sweating, and, a sort of a lower salt content in their sweat, just to sort of preserve those electrolytes in the body. It's really important to note that employees who have been on extended leave, new employees, and contract workers from cooler climatic locations will not be acclimatized. This must be taken into consideration when scheduling work in a really hot environment. So you must ensure that, it's better to ensure that the systems of work in place are sufficient to account for acclimatization. And it's important not to push to the point of exhaustion to acclimatize quicker, but the best results will come from gradually increasing the work time in hot conditions, just allowing for time to cool off and fully rehydrate between shifts.
Oh, perfect. Thank you for that, Ryan. There's lots of different control measures there and interesting information, especially, the information about acclimatization, I think potentially is something that businesses may not think of. So it's a really important topic to include. So, if PCBUs, if they want some more information about managing exposure to heat stress, where can they go? Are there any resources that they can use?
So they can check out the SafeWork SA Heat and UV webpage. There's also a SafeWork Australia guide for managing the risks of working in heat. And SafeWork SA also have a code of practice for managing the work environment and facilities. So check those out.
Yeah, perfect. And so those are there in those QR codes on the screen, and I'll leave that up for a second just in case if anyone wants to have a look, but you can always go back to the recording as well and scan that QR code. So thanks, Ryan, for that great overview of heat stress, for sharing a lot of practical advice for our listeners today. So Ryan will be sticking around to the end for the Q&A. So please, if you have any questions for him, and I saw there was already a couple in there, please pop them in the Q&A section. And I might just give you a few seconds to do that if you've got any questions about the heat stress topic, or if you want to click those QR codes. All right, so we are now going to move on to UV radiation and to Elysia, who's going to talk about UV exposure and prevention in the workplace. So to start with, Elysia, what actually is UV radiation?
Thanks, Katie. So UV stands for ultraviolet radiation and is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which arranges different types of energy by the size of their wavelength. So the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. Electromagnetic energy spans from very long radio rays to very short gamma rays across that spectrum. So when you tune your radio, watch TV, send a text message, or use the microwave, you're using electromagnetic energy. The sun emits 3 types of energy, which are grouped together as solar radiation. And this includes infrared radiation, which we feel as heat but cannot see, visible light, which we see as all the colours of the rainbow, and UV radiation, which we cannot detect with any of our senses. And UV radiation can be further categorised as UVA, UVB, and UVC rays. UVA is the longest wave and closest to visible light. So most of this actually reaches the Earth's surface. A small amount of UVB also reaches Earth, but UVC is blocked by the ozone layer. So both UVA and B wavelengths can damage unprotected skin. Now, this damage occurs to the DNA or the genetic part of our skin cells. In some cases, the damage can be repaired or the cells will be destroyed, but a lot of the damage is irreparable and missed, meaning that the damaged skin cells go on and replicate and accumulate over our lifetime, which increases our risk of skin cancer developing. The amount of UV exposure, overexposure to UV, that is needed, or our kind of susceptibility to skin cancer, does vary greatly between individuals. And so it's not easily quantified, but we do know that when we're outside during daylight hours and our skin is unprotected, damage can occur. This UVA wavelengths can reach the dermis layer of our skin and cause wrinkling and premature aging and skin cancer. And UVB is responsible for that sunburn reaction and also contributes to skin cancer development. So tanning and sunburn are both visible signs of that damage occurring, and it occurs relatively soon after that UV exposure. But lots of the damage occurs right at that DNA level, as I mentioned earlier, and therefore it's invisible to us. And skin cancer is usually a result of accumulated damage over our lifetime. And it's often this lag time between the exposure to UV and when skin cancer develops that often makes people complacent about protecting their skin.
Yeah, thanks, Elysia. That's interesting stuff. I guess most of us would associate sunburn or getting a tan with spending time outside during the summer months or on really hot days. But does the temperature actually make a difference when it comes to UV exposure?
Yeah, so an important part of understanding UV radiation is that it's independent of temperature, or that infrared radiation. So it's a common misconception that heat and UV are related, and some of this kind of confusion is because we're more likely to notice visible effects such as sunburn and tanning during the summer and springtime, which coincide with warmer weather. But actually in SA, we have damaging levels of UV for up to 75% of the year. And for some people, that risk is present year round as well. So UV levels, or the intensity, varies in each season, and this is due to the angle of the sun in the sky and not how hot or cold the temperature is. During our summer months, the sun is higher in the sky and UV has less atmosphere to travel through to reach us at the Earth's surface. So this results in higher UV levels. And we can see from this graph a bit of a demonstration of this and that difference between heat and UV. So the blue line represents UV and the red line represents temperature. We can see that they behave and reach their peaks or maximum level at different times of the day. So UV levels peak around the middle of the day, while the temperature is still rising towards its maximum in the afternoon. So UV and heat do present separate hazards in the workplace. And while some of the control measures will mitigate risks of both, it's important important to understand their differences and when they need to be managed separately.
Okay, so to prevent getting sunburnt, we should focus on the UV level, not the heat, not the temperature. I'm sure that surprised some people listening. I know when I first found that out, it definitely surprised me. So what are the consequences of being exposed to UV radiation?
Yeah, so apart from prematurely aging our skin, cancer is the most serious consequence to overexposure to UV, and it can be fatal. So most skin cancers, including deadly melanoma, are caused by overexposure to UV radiation. And despite it being largely preventable, around 2 in 3 Australians will be diagnosed with a skin cancer in their lifetime. It's almost 2,000 people die from skin cancer each year. We also see thousands of skin cancers caused by occupational UV exposure each year. We know that men are twice as likely to die from melanoma than women, which is especially concerning as the majority of outdoor workforce is male, so they're at greater risk. We know that skin cancer is very costly and costs the healthcare system around $2 billion. We also know that UV radiation is a class 1 carcinogen. So this is the same class as asbestos and tobacco, and it means it has been proven to cause cancer in humans. So it's a huge problem, taking all this into consideration, and PCBUs must protect their workers from UV radiation exposure. And this is under the Work Health and Safety Act, under those sections that Ryan mentioned earlier.
Yeah, perfect. Lots of pretty sobering statistics there about the real effect that UV exposure has on people. So we know that PCBUs should use the risk management process to manage hazards in the workplace, as Ryan mentioned earlier. So after we've identified the hazard, which in this case would be UV radiation, how can PCBUs assess the worker's risk of UV exposure, and what factors should they consider when doing this?
Yeah. So when it comes to assessing the risk of UV, the local and current context is really important. So as Ryan mentioned, different sort of work situations have their own unique challenges. And so when it comes to UV radiation exposure, PCBUs should look at regular assessments to identify the workers who are exposed to UV by doing their tasks, the situations and the work systems where that exposure occurs. So the when and the where. And when completing the risk assessment, be really mindful that UV levels are affected by a number of different factors. So these include things like geographical location. So all around the world, UV varies according to your proximity to the equator. The closer you are, the higher the UV is. And Australia is quite close to the equator. But due to kind of our landmass, we're quite a big continent, we do see differences right across the country, and even differences between the northern and southern parts of South Australia. So just to kind of demonstrate, you see on the image, we see extreme UV conditions for all of Australia in January, so right now, coloured in purple, and varying intensities across the country in June. So in our winter time, we still see damaging levels in the northern parts, but it does vary right across the country. We know that elevation, or our height above sea level, also impacts UV levels. So at higher altitudes, a thinner atmosphere filters less UV radiation. And for every 1,000 metres increase in altitude, there's approximately an increase of around 12% in UV. UV also varies at different times of the year. So this is in relation to the angle of the sun to the Earth's surface. So just as we experience changes in weather across different seasons, UV also varies. So for Australia, we're in the southern hemisphere, and because of our location, our proximity to the equator and the tilt of the Earth, we do experience UV levels that are exacerbated or much greater compared to corresponding northern latitudes. So this is part of the reason that we have the highest rates of skin cancer in the world, just because we're exposed to higher intensity of UV. So as we saw on the graph on a previous slide, across a single day, UV levels also vary. So they start low when the sun is low in the sky, and they reach their peak or their maximum level in the middle of the day when the sun is highest in the sky, and then they start to drop down again as we move toward the afternoon. So on a clear sky day with very little clouds, UV follows that smooth, even bell curve trend. But on cloudy days, levels can be a bit more erratic. So it's not a nice, smooth kind of trend. They still peak in the middle of the day, but rather than a smooth line, they look a bit more like a heart rate monitor where they're going up and down. Quite erratically, and it really depends on the type and the density of the cloud as well. So UV can be scattered and reflected, and the overall result could be an increase in UV reaching the Earth's surface, or when we have those denser type clouds, they can actually block and reduce some of the UV. But important to note that no clouds will completely block UV from reaching Earth, and so they're definitely not a reason to neglect sun protection. The pattern and length of exposure to UV also contributes to the overall exposure, but it all kind of adds up across the day. So we might experience UV exposure through ongoing episodes. So we might be outside all day, or a series of shorter episodes where we're in and out, and they all kind of contribute and add up over the day. And just as clouds can scatter and reflect UV, the surfaces and the materials around us can also reflect UV, resulting in that indirect exposure. So, for example, surfaces that are soft or rough and darker in colour are less likely to reflect the same amount as hard, smooth or light coloured surfaces. We also need to be aware of photosensitizers, which can be substances, including some industrial chemicals, particular plants, medications, or even medical conditions that cause eyes and skin to be abnormally sensitive to UV radiation. So there's an increased risk of an increased person risk to skin cancer to an individual where photosensitizers are in play. So really important to check whether any workers could be suffering from photosensitivity, refer to the safety data sheets for all the products that are used in the workplace, and identify any of those photosensitizing substances. Really important when we're assessing the risk of UV exposure to always consider the availability and whether or not the controls are actually being used to determine how well that risk is being managed. So as we heard, most times we are outdoors during daylight hours. We are exposed to UV radiation. The amount or intensity does vary depending on when the work is being done, where, our location, and our surroundings, including those sources of indirect UV. And just as Ryan mentioned earlier, there's no stop work temperature. There's also no stop work for UV levels. It's really important to know that when even when UV levels are low, situations of extended exposure contribute to skin damage. So our outdoor workers receive up to 10 times more UV radiation than indoor workers. So they're just by being outside for that sheer amount of time puts them at greater risk. So always really important to assess the risk for your local context and implement the most appropriate controls. And we recommend for outdoor workers that year-round controls are needed.
Yeah, wow, that's a crazy statistic that, you know, outdoor workers receive 10 times more UV radiation than indoor workers. That's, yeah, it's crazy. Big numbers.
Yeah.
So, you know, obviously you've talked about the sun and the UV rays coming from the sun. Are there any other sources of UV exposure that we should be worried about other than the sun?
Yeah, good question, Katie. So we know that UVA and UVB from the sun can damage our skin, but those shorter UVC rays don't reach the Earth's surface. They're blocked by the ozone, but they can actually be present from artificial sources. So it's particularly concerning because these UVC rays are a higher energy and they have the potential for more damage than those shorter rays, the longer rays. So some examples of those artificial sources include tanning beds, which thankfully are banned for commercial use in Australia. Things like arc welders, curing lamps, bug zappers, high-intensity lighting, sterilisation equipment, things that are used in hospitals. So these are artificial sources, and they can directly emit that UV radiation in all wavelengths, so across the A, B and C spectrums, and also keeping in mind that this UV can be reflected off the hard and smooth surfaces around you. So, for example, welding metal is quite a reflective environment. So while not all the artificial sources do pose a hazard, for example, bug zappers and fluoro lights emit quite low levels, it is important to ensure that effective controls are in place. So things like shielding or warning signs, adequate training, and personal protective equipment are all really important, including clothing that's actually been assessed to make sure that radiation protection against the UVC rays as well.
Okay, so, once PCBUs have assessed the risk of exposure from all the different sources, what control measures can they put in place to protect their workers?
Yeah, so really important that employees and workers are working together on a comprehensive UV protection program that includes as many of the protective measures using the hierarchy of controls. So looking at elimination, substitution and isolation, these controls are generally quite difficult or not possible in relation to UV radiation. We can't get rid of the sun or substitute it for something else. Engineering controls are really important, and where we can look to modify the local environment and help reduce the amount of UV. Looking at our admin controls to look at the procedures of the way that we organise our work so that we can reduce exposure to individual workers. Education and training, really important to improve and maintain knowledge and skills. PPE is the last line of defence, as with any hazard, but still really important in providing that personal barrier between individuals and UV. And because of the nature of many outdoor industries, it often means that other control measures can be quite challenging to implement. So there is quite a reliance on PPE in this situation, but remembering to always consult with workers and regularly review these controls and for their effectiveness. So just some examples of what control measures will look like for solar UV radiation exposure. So it may be possible to eliminate UV by moving work indoors. This is only where obviously the circumstances would permit, and I understand often not practical for many industries, especially where work doesn't occur at a fixed address. Alternatively, rotating jobs between workers where particular activities can be done indoors or at least in well-shaded areas, just to help reduce that exposure by ensuring that no individual worker is outdoors for extended periods. So the example that Ryan gave around switching jobs between workers to eliminate heat or reduce heat exposure, the same can be done for UV. An example of effective engineering control is providing shade. So where possible, moving tasks under shade and providing good quality shade for meal and rest breaks. Shade can come in the form of built, natural or temporary, and all options will help kind of reduce that overall amount of UV that individuals are exposed to. Of course, being aware of any reflective surfaces and avoiding changing or modifying them to reduce that reflective or indirect UV exposure. Window tinting is another control that can reduce the amount of UV entering a vehicle or plant equipment. So again, you're going to control for heat and UV. So that's a nice combo control there. When it comes to administrative controls, the scheduling work to avoid that peak UV time in the middle of the day, so starting work earlier or working later in the afternoon can be an option. Educating workers about working safely in the sun, providing training where applicable. Also a really good idea to provide information on skin cancer early detection and encouraging workers to check their skin regularly or go for a professional skin check as well. So personal protective equipment, again, just ensures that outdoor workers are protected in as many ways as possible. So looking at sun protective clothing, hats, sunglasses and sunscreen. And these should be included as a condition of work or provided to workers where that's feasible for the workplace. So in addition, documentation such as a UV or a sun protection policy is a good way to kind of record in writing why and how the risk of UV radiation is being managed at your workplace. Good to determine what type of document is most suitable. So whether it's a policy, procedure, code of conduct, what's going to work for your workplace, whether it needs to be a new standalone or if it can be added into an existing one to include UV radiation. And this really also helps to set up expectations around the workplace culture and supporting UV protection as the norm, similar to Ryan mentioned for making it acceptable and culturally appropriate to, take those breaks from heat. Taking breaks from UV and protecting yourself is really important. So on this next slide, slip, slop, slap, seek and slide, hopefully a familiar saying to all our audience, but just as at Cancer Council, we recommend these 5 sun protection measures to all South Australians. They can also be applied in the workplace setting as the requirements for appropriate PPE and those individual controls that workers can implement. So slipping on sun protective clothing, including long sleeves or at least elbow length, shirts with collars and trousers, covering up as much skin as possible, looking at clothing that's labelled with a UPF or an ultraviolet protection factor of 50 plus will provide excellent protection. A lot of uniform suppliers these days have actually paid for their garments to be tested so that they can use this kind of rating. And looking at lightweight materials with a high percentage of natural fibres can really help with that heat mitigation as well. People are more likely to keep their sleeves rolled down as well if it's nice, breathable, lightweight material. So next, slopping on SPF 50 or 50 plus broad spectrum water resistant sunscreen and applying this liberally to any exposed skin that you can't otherwise cover up with clothing. 20 minutes before going outside for that first application, and remembering to reapply every 2 hours or more frequently if you are sweating or rubbing it off. And this just helps to reinforce that protective layer and keep it at an appropriate level. There are many different products available these days, and it might take a bit of trial and error to find something that best suits your needs, but certainly we have dry touch sports and work formulas that are designed to be non-greasy and that kind of matte finish. Next, we want to slap on a hat to protect our face, head, ears and neck, very common places for skin cancer to develop. So looking at a broad-brimmed bucket or Legionnaire style hat with a brim width of at least 7.5 centimetres. We don't recommend caps. They absolutely do not provide enough protection. So your ears are left at the back of your neck and much of your face is left unprotected. If you do need to wear a hard hat or a helmet for your job, using brim attachments and those neck flaps is a really good way to still get that UV protection. Seeking shade wherever possible, particularly in that middle part of the day and during breaks. Again, looking at built, natural or portable options such as marquees if that's practical, or awnings on vehicles can be another way to provide shade. And last but not least, sliding on a good pair of wraparound sunglasses that sit nice and close to the eye area and meet the Australian New Zealand standards. Looking for a lens category of 2 or 3 is perfect for everyday use, or you can get very dark special purpose lenses of a category 4, keeping in mind they're not suitable for driving though. If you do need to wear eye protectors or safety glasses, looking at products that are rated O for outdoor use, and again, that comply with Australian New Zealand standards.
Oh, thank you for that, Elysia. There's lots of good ideas in there that businesses can use, to protect their workers from UV exposure. And I think, it's important to remember that, we know our slip, slop, slap, seek and slide, but, that I guess shouldn't be the only thing we're doing. So if PCBUs, if they want some more information about managing UV exposure, where can they go?
Yeah, so we do have a range of resources available, including the comprehensive skin cancer and outdoor work. So this is a work health safety guide. You can access this by scanning the QR code on the left, or if you would like a hard copy resource, this can be ordered from our resource order form on our website. Additionally, we have our Sun Smart Workplace Online Learning, which is a series of 8 videos. Again, the similar information, just in video format. Again, there's a QR code there if you'd like to scan that to access those. Just pause for a moment. And the other thing that we can offer is our SunSmart Workplace Consultation Program. So this really allows us to provide that one-on-one support to PCBUs to review or develop their sun protection policy to look at control measures that will suit their situation. We also offer cancer prevention sessions, which are basically an information session for workers on ways to reduce cancer risk. So this includes UV protection, but a number of other topics. So for both these services, there's a fee for service. If you're interested in finding more about these, please do get in touch with me via email, prevention@cancersa.org.au, and that will come up on a future slide as well.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Elysia, for that in-depth look at UV exposure, and also for taking the time to speak today and present. So what we're going to do now is we'll move into the Q&A section of the webinar. So I can see there's already quite a few questions in the Q&A tab, and if there's any others, please put them in there, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in this time. So first question I can see here is, and this would be more focused to Elysia. Are the lights used in nail salons a source of UVC? Is there any research on the use of these?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it does kind of come up from time to time. So to my knowledge today is that they do emit a low level of UV, but with that, there is a small amount of risk. So if you would like to, take precautions against that, you could use things like the fingerless gloves to kind of protect the back of the hand, or applying sunscreen before getting your nails done. It's quite a low level risk, but certainly the evidence is still kind of emerging there, and there's no kind of, I guess, there's no high level of risk, if you like. But yeah, if you are concerned, fingerless gloves, sunscreen is a good way to kind of help reduce that.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So next question, are there any risk assessment templates or examples to assist with assessing risk of heat stress and UV? So I guess that's directed to both of you.
Yeah, I'll go first if you like, Ryan.
Sure.
The Workhouse Safety Guide that I mentioned with the QR code, there is a risk assessment template on there that's also available to download from our website as well.
Yeah, so on the SafeWork SA website, there's a bit of information around sort of assessing the risk with especially heat stress. But in those sort of guidance documents I provided, it goes a bit more into detail as to how to identify, assess, and control. Yeah, I think at the moment, so WorkSafe Queensland have a pretty fleshed out website, and I think they have like a flow chart that sort of goes through some of the steps that people should take, especially with forming a risk assessment and things like that. So yeah, we're trying to update our website to reflect some of that too. But
perfect, thanks guys. So another question, can you reverse sun UV damage?
Oh, great question. Unfortunately, no. So a lot of that damage does happen at that DNA level. Our body does have kind of mechanisms to either repair it or destroy the cell, but a lot of that does get passed on to new cells and kind of stays with us for our life. So a lot of the damage is done. As I said, how much is needed for it to then flip over and then trigger skin cancer development is quite unknown. It does vary between individuals. So just because I want to bring a bit of good news to this, just because a lot of damage might have already been done doesn't necessarily mean you will get skin cancer, and certainly it is absolutely never too late to start protecting your skin.
Perfect, thank you. In workplace procedures, would you recommend combining UV with a heat-related procedure or keeping the processes separate?
I can tackle this one if you like. Yeah, so I think there is a lot of crossover between heat and UV. I think a lot of the controls that will be used for UV or heat stress will just protect against one or the other. So I think we talked about tinted windows and shades. Like a lot of UV exposure can lead to a lot of heat stress as well. So it could be worth sort of tackling them both in the same. But yeah, so things like, I guess, sunscreen and whatnot, I suppose, Elysia, would be more UV.
Yeah, you make absolutely great points there, Ryan. I guess my only concern with combining them is where there's instances of no heat, so heat isn't a risk, but UV is still present. And so as long as that's clearly put out in a procedure, that you would still need those UV control measures even in colder type parts of the year, and those work situations, then there's no issue. It's really an individual kind of preference whether to combine or keep separate.
Yeah, good point. Very good point.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Are there any examples of work heat related fatalities that can be referenced? And there was another question here which asked about, does SafeWork Australia have stats on which industries have the most deaths from UV/heat stress?
I'll tackle the statistics one first. I'm not aware of any sort of statistics that SafeWork Australia have on any workplaces specifically that sort of have statistics on heat stress. I'm just trying to find that question. On the most deaths from UV or heat stress. Yeah, sorry, I'm not exactly aware of any sort of industries. I guess sort of we've just sort of seen what we've seen and whatnot in certain sorts of industries. And personally, I do not recall any sort of cases of death from heat stress that I've personally dealt with. But yeah, there are certainly a few cases out there. I think there's even the Canadian OC Health Safety Committee, I believe is what they're called. They have a few examples on their website of some cases of heat stress. So yeah, probably worth checking those out as well. Not to say that it doesn't happen in Australia.
Yep. So I'll just speak to UV. There are, in terms of where cases would be more predominant, would certainly see, generally speaking, higher rates of skin cancer in Queensland, based to the proximity to the equator there. They experience damaging UV level and very high levels right throughout the year. So they definitely would have higher cases. When it comes to kind of that proving fatality from occupational exposure, that can be quite challenging. Lawyers will fight very hard to say, on behalf of the employer, that it wasn't the occupational exposure, it was more the recreational exposure. And so there's not a lot of good kind of examples that kind of come to the top of my mind, but it does happen. It is quite a tricky thing to prove, I think, in terms of workplace claims and things like that for the current system. But there are examples out there. There are a few listed in that resource I mentioned earlier as well.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. I might go with two more. So some 50+ sunscreen lotions do not provide adequate protection as stated on the container. Is there an Australian standard that must be adhered to before allowing the sale of these products?
Yeah, yep, good question. So all sunscreens that are sold in Australia do undergo vigorous testing through the TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration. They need to be registered, and there is a standard that they must adhere to. So a product sold in Australia cannot claim to be SPF 50, 50 plus. There are some strict regulations on what actually can be listed on the product. I cannot speak for any products purchased overseas. Their SPF ratings are very different. They don't have the same testing and things like that. So yeah, anything sold in Australia that does have those claims on the packaging must adhere to that, and you will see a little number alongside on the label with OST L, something like that on there generally.
Perfect. I had a question here about cooling vests. So just, wanting some more information. Are cooling vests good? What are they, please?
Yeah, so cooling vests, as it says, it's a vest that cools you down. So some of them can take the form of, they can have little pockets for ice packs and whatnot. And then some can also be sort of battery powered, so just with ventilation, cooling and whatnot. So they are sort of a PPE control, and if I guess it depends on the sort of work that can require them. I've never personally used one, but yeah, they seem to be pretty decent from accounts at sort of controlling just some of that metabolic workload of the worker. Cooling down workers is one of the key sort of preventions of sort of heat-related illnesses. There's a lot on the market though. So yeah, technology is going wild these days. Oh, sorry, Katie, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I was. Thank you.
No worries.
Sorry, I was just helping a couple of people were asking for some links to things, so I was just popping them in the chat. That's why I had myself on mute. Anyway, so this will be the last question for today. So when a PCBU implements the TWL process assessment, such as using a Kestrel 5400 to monitor environmental conditions, are they required to strictly follow the TWL criteria, or can they adapt it to better suit their needs? For example, if resourcing limits prevent adhering to a strict work/rest cycle, can alternative controls like water misters be used instead?
Yeah, so I don't believe the legislation requires anything specifically for the thermal working limit. I don't see why not as to, I think it may be reasonable to sort of adapt it to better suit your needs. If you find that's better at sort of, taking into account to monitor the conditions to sort of, work out those thermal working limits for your workers. Sorry, I'm just trying to read the question a bit more. I hope I've answered a little bit there. I'm strictly following the time limit. Yeah, so I think the criteria for the thermal working limit. I'm just talking in terms of South Australia. I think I don't believe there's legislation that requires the thermal working limit to be adhered to, or it doesn't refer to that sort of indice of measuring. So yeah, I believe it would be reasonable to suit it to your needs if you wanted to use misters and implement sort of work and resting cycles.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan.
I hope that answers your question. Sorry, a bit technical.
Yeah, and like if there is any other questions that we didn't get to today, or you want some more technical support, I've just popped that there on our screen, on the screen. So there's the SafeWork information and also the Cancer Council information. So for the SafeWork information, that 1300 number goes to our help centre, so you can pull through any questions, and any more technical questions, just pop it there into that email address. And of course our website there as well. And then we've also got Elysia's email address that she mentioned earlier, and also the phone number and the website for more information. So please feel free to contact either of us for more information. So thank you so much for joining us today, for your participation. So we really hope that you found the information useful and that you can take something away from today to ensure that we are protecting ourselves from illness and exposure when working in the sun and heat. So a special thank you to our presenters. So thank you so much, Ryan, for being here, and Elysia as well. Thank you. We appreciate all your input. So that's all from us here. And as I said before, if you have any other further questions, please direct them to the channels on your screen. Thank you again. We'll see you next time. Just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded, and so it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in soon. So keep an eye out for that. If any of those QR code links, if you want to grab any of them or want any of the information. Perfect. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.